Hey you guys! So we're going to go over a little bit of Chapter 2, Introducing Environmental Laws, Economics, and Ethics when it comes to environmental science. It's important to understand the history of where we were so we know where we're going. Where we've been always helps us to understand why we are how we are now. So let's talk a little bit about some of the important laws and things that have happened in the history of the U.S. in terms of environmental science. So here's a little timeline, okay? Some important things. We had in the early U.S. time frame, we were dominated by the frontier attitude. So we were all about going out, cutting things down, clearing land, building things with that lumber. And so we didn't really think about the long-term effects of that in terms of the environment and the habitats that we were destroying along the way. So we had some early conservationists that were influential in raising environmental concerns later on in that early period of the U.S. One really important person, John James Audubon, you're going to see his work in just a minute as well. He was pretty early on in that. Henry David Thoreau, his time period kind of overlaps with John James Audubon, but he was also very instrumental in the early conservation movement. And then you had George Perkins Marsh. All three of these guys are very important in the early U.S. environmental history period. We also had our first national park at Yellowstone. So that was kind of like the late 1800s. That's really monumental. Our first national park is still around. Then we had the development of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks not too long after that. Now we're in the General Revision Act. So in the General Revision Act, this is a law that was put into place that allowed a lot of things to happen, and specifically, President Roosevelt used this act to establish 43 million acres of forest reserves, and other presidents did as well. So we like to refer back to this act in terms of important legislation that has led to kind of the environmental movement we have now. All right, when you have different worldviews, they can clash, but sometimes your different worldviews can actually allow you to come together for a common cause. So in this case, we had Theodore Roosevelt, who was a utilitarian, and we had John Muir, who is a preservationist. And so Theodore Roosevelt, his utilitarian views really allowed him to focus on the use of things, where John Muir really wanted to preserve things. But they were able to come together because Theodore Roosevelt saw that there was a good use to a lot of the things that he wanted to conserve that land for future generations. So Franklin Roosevelt established the Civilian Conservation Corps. Okay. Then you had Aldo Leopold. His Sand County Almanac was published posthumously, so after he passed away, his book was then published, and it was a really good work that led us to understanding some of the effects that people were seeing in the environment from our actions. You then had Rachel Carson. She published The Silent Spring. She was an early activist as well. You can see her here in this picture. Then we had the Wilderness Act of 1964 that was spurred on by Wallace Stegner. Okay. Then you had this book, The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, that was published mid-1900s, kind of a cry to understanding what was going to happen to the earth if we continued our population boom as it was happening right before our very eyes. This is also one of the time frames that they started noticing the massive jump in population. It was just doubling and doubling and doubling. So we had this exponential growth instead of the logistic growth that we had in the past. We had our first Earth Day, which was really monumental as well. We still celebrate that every year. All right, so here is kind of a decade at a time. So in the 70s, you can see a general timeline of history in the U.S. or kind of in the world too. Some of these things are not just here in the U.S., but you can do a general 1970s timeline, some 1980s, like the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 was pretty monumental. In the 90s, we had a lot of legislation that happened. We had a UN conference in 92 called the Earth Summit that was in Brazil. A lot of top thinkers in the world came together, and a lot of things have been happening since that point in time. In 99, the human population reached 6 billion people. That's pretty monumental. Then in the early 2000s, you can see some of the things, like in 2001, President Bush decided that the United States would not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, which did mandate reductions in CO2 emissions to kind of combat global warming as a globe, as opposed to just one nation. But it did bring a lot of awareness to the CO2 emissions here in the U.S. And so we were able to start moving toward more, hybrid cars, electric cars, and things like that. Okay, so when it comes to legislation with our current government, the way things are set up, this is kind of how things happen. So every time that a law is written or an act is put into place, it first has to go through this process of developing an environmental impact statement, which will answer all of the questions here in these blue and yellow bubbles. So the National Environmental Policy Act is the one that said that all federally proposed actions draft an environmental impact statement. So it will answer these questions. It will tell the legislation, will the project destroy wildlife habitat? How will the landscape be altered? Will the project harm any endangered species? Will there be a change in stream flow rates? Will the project harm air quality? Or will an increase in soil erosion lower our water quality? So all of these things have to be answered in this environmental impact statement as part of an action, any of the federally proposed actions that get put into place. So anytime we're addressing new environmental problems with our governmental policies, we first identify the problem, which sounds a lot like the scientific method. Then you'll have a U.S. congressperson that will draft legislation. Okay, there will be a full cost accounting evaluation in that process. So someone is responsible in that process for evaluating how much this is going to cost us, okay, and basically who's going to pay for that. Then the legislation is passed. It'll be signed by the president, all right? A lot of things happen in between this time period, but basically once the president signs it, then the EPA will develop regulations as a result of that legislation, okay? Then you'll have some public comments, and basically you'll have a lot of scrutiny on it. You'll have a lot of commentators on different news outlets that will try to, debate over it and things like that. You'll then have a review by the OMB. The review will approve the funding or not, or say, where it's going to come from. And then the regulations will be implemented and enforced by states for the most part. So this is things like, how we can use our land, fishing regulations, hunting regulations, the kinds of things that we're able to do, zoning for land and things like that, what we're allowed to do at the state level. So if it says, residential zoning, then it's only for housing, things like that. So those kinds of regulations are implemented and enforced usually by the state. So here are some really monumental environmental laws that have been passed. You can read through this, kind of just a general timeline. So you can kind of see they're all about conservation, land management, things like that. All right, so what has been the effect since 1970? Well, we have 8 national parks. We have the National Wilderness Preservation System that was established in that time period. We have a lot more state parks as well now. Substantial soil erosion reduction. So there's just been more of a focus on the long-term effects of the things that we do and how it affects the environment, and soil erosion is one of those things that we have to look at. Many endangered species are doing much better, so we've been more mindful of how we affect the environment of those endangered species, and helping their population as opposed to hurting it. And then we have the emissions of many pollutants that have been reduced. So this is the focus on our hybrid cars. More electric cars have been developed, and even things like solar panels that have been implemented. We've been looking for alternative energy sources to using things that emit CO2 and things like that. So we've tried to steer away from using coal as our primary source for energy and try to find alternatives to that are a little bit more environmental friendly.